What's up, everybody? Good day, afternoon, whatever time of day you happen to be listening to this podcast. This is another episode of Real Talk with Andrew Gillum. And I am, again, continuously excited about this particular series of conversations because today, we're going to be trying to dig a little bit deeper into the Florida story. I've heard from you. We've all heard from you. Everybody wants to know what's the matter with Florida, or at least what's up with Florida. I've gotten consistently how in the world from, 2018, this performance, 16 to 18 to now 2020. And what we've been trying to do here through a series of conversations with people who were observers or involved on the ground, some in the air, involved in the Florida performance in the 2020 election. And we've been trying to bring some of those thoughts, those opinions, some of those disappointments, but also some of those successes so that people can get a much clearer picture. I think, and my guests who I'm going to introduce in a minute, hopefully, in their own way will further validate this thought. But having been a candidate for statewide office in Florida, I think people outside of the state of Florida, and frankly, even inside of the state of Florida, just have no real sense of how big, vast, diverse the state of Florida is, even within our respective groups, if you will. So we often hear the black vote. Well, that's shorthand, but the truth is black voters are not a monolith. They did perform very impressively for their candidates of this choice this cycle. The Latino vote, not a monolith, and especially not a monolith in a state of Florida where it is vastly different. And I should also mention, I talked about black voters, but within black voters, part of that non-monolith are not just amongst African-American black voters, but we're talking about, particularly in the southern corridor of this state, black voters who are coming from many of the Caribbean islands, frankly, other countries and cultures who relate very, very differently and also bring a whole different value set to the conversation. The geopolitical politics of South America also complicate a great deal of this. So when you hear us in these conversations, maybe refer to the black vote or the Latino vote or whatever, just know that it's shorthand and that we at least understand that the question is much, much, much deeper. People want to know a lot about Florida, but particularly folks would like for us to drill a little bit deeper into what is happening in Florida as it relates to the Latino vote. And again, shorthand, don't get me mixed. I don't want all your emails and comments about what that looks like. I understand. And so what we've tried to do in this particular episode is assemble, frankly, some of the most incredible organizer leaders that we have going for us in the state of Florida. One of the big challenges of our state, quite frankly, is the inconsistency in investment when it comes to building and strengthening the ground. Everybody wants to talk about the overnight success of Georgia, except if you were to talk one-on-one with Stacey Abrams or any of the members of the early part of that work, they will tell you that Georgia has been 10 to 15 years in the making. I remember Alicia Keys doing this commercial saying, my overnight success, as she was being described, has been 20 years in the making. The truth is that there's a lot of labor that goes into this thing before you get to the point where you can begin to celebrate these crazy wins. So that's enough of me. I want to welcome my good friend, another incredible organizing leader, Andrea Mercado, who is the executive director of New Florida Majority. She's also the co-founder of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, where she was the director of campaigns for 5 years. And again, just incredible work. My other friend, Corinne Freeman, who is the state director for Florida for All Education Fund, and is formerly the project manager for the statewide alignment group, also known as SWAG, which is a coalition of nonprofits across Florida that came together to increase the civic engagement of the state's many diverse communities. And I must just exclamation mark, many of those communities who are oftentimes left out of the conversation, but are at the center of the impact of public policy. And so really, really important. And then finally, Marcos Villar, the executive director of Alianza for Progress, based in Central Florida, an organization that seeks to unite the Puerto Rican and the Hispanic population throughout the state of Florida to develop leaders from within the community that will support progressive policies. What's up, everybody? You can wave, you can say what's up, you can put a thumbs up. They can hear y'all. Listen, I know before we started broadcasting, everybody, I was checking in just on people's, how you doing? What's up? You feel all right? Of course, all of us gave the same sort of hum, like, we all right. We're doing okay. Because I want you to know that when you love a place, and more importantly, when you love a people, these elections and the outcomes of those elections can hit you very, very deeply. Because you know who sits at the greatest impact. Oftentimes, the greatest of the worst of the impacts are oftentimes the people that many of these leaders are working with on a pretty regular basis. So before I get into some specific questions, I'm going to start with you, Andrea. I would just like you to just quickly define, because although this conversation may be focused a lot on the Latino vote, I'd love for you to just talk more broadly. And again, just for a minute, tell us the scope of your target population and the work you do.
Sure. So New Florida Majority has been in partnership with many other organizations across the state, really targeting voters that are usually ignored, oftentimes by both political parties, to be honest. What's termed low propensity voters, right? Mm-hmm. People who are unlikely to vote, or maybe they vote in one election and then they don't vote in another election for a few years. And we'll focus on communities of color, of Black and Brown communities that we believe are central to the new majority coalition to transform the state and transform this nation. And this last election cycle, we were part of an effort called Florida for All that was targeting 3 million Black and Brown communities, 3 million voters in Black and Brown communities in 19 counties in the state. So a heavy focus on some of our densest and most populated urban areas. But, we definitely tried to expand our reach because we knew what was at stake. And we knew that we could leave no stone unturned and that we were going to have to pour our hearts and our souls and our energy into doing what had to be done. And I think we're really proud that Team Florida was part of the victory that made Trump a one-term president. And we can kind of get more into that. But I firmly believe that, even though Florida's 29 electoral votes went for Donald Trump, Biden and Harris would not be going to the White House without the battle that we waged on the ground here in Florida that forced the Republican Party to really focus here.
Very, very good. Very good point, Andrea. And then, Corinne, I would love for you to talk with us a moment about, because of, and legally, if this becomes a difficult thing for you to be able to do, if you need to make some different bifurcations here for legal purposes, so that you don't get at cross purposes with your various jobs and responsibilities, I want you to give us a little bit of an inlet into not just the work that was done in this 2020 election cycle with Florida for All Education Fund. If you wouldn't mind just backing up a bit to give us an inlet into what the statewide organizing group of progressive organizations in Florida, who again work at the crossroads of impact of public policy, particularly on more marginalized communities. Tell us a little bit about what the arc of that work has been. And then if you wouldn't mind spending a minute talking about what the Education Fund did in this 2020 cycle in Florida.
Absolutely. So Andrea is one of the people who I work most closely with in state. And just to provide context, Florida's progressive infrastructure for the past about 6, 7, maybe even going on 8 years, has done the best it can to really coalesce, to work together, to build deep alignment, to have some of the biggest impact that we can have. Because we understand that just one time, annual, maybe 2-year campaign, broad-based coalition work does not create the depth of change that we need it to do. But what we really need is alignment and collaboration with our groups, making sure that we are all headed in the same direction deeply in order for us to see the types of wins that we want to see. And like you said, Andrew, earlier, most of the people who, even I think in Florida, may think Florida is a lost cause, may think Florida is hard red. It is red, red, red.
Yeah.
But in terms of the progressive movement, we are the strongest that we have ever been. And if you ask me and many of the people who are deeply entrenched in this work, Florida is actually the purplest that it will be. It is very, very, very deeply purple. It has the potential to flip because of the coordinated collaborative work that's happening cross-organizationally, across issues, to have different people, to have different organizations focusing on, well, this is how we're going to do this strategy. This is how we're going to work in the background. This is who's going to approach this. And we're all working together, sharing resources to make things happen and to move things. And with that said, Florida for All Education Fund was developed because of much of the statewide collaboration. It is a public coordination collaboration vehicle that really focused on C3 election protection work in a very collaborative way and a culturally competent way for Black and Brown communities to make sure that the most vulnerable communities were protected this electoral cycle. And so we did that across 14 counties throughout early vote and election day. And we had about 1,500 volunteers in total protecting their communities and looking at election protection, poll monitoring, election defense as an act of community care, and not just this transactional every 4-year piece of work that you do, but they see it as protecting their communities to build power so that they can win.
I love that. And Corinne, because I don't want people to have this question and then not have it answered in the short time that we have together. I, as a Floridian, born and raised in this state, has organized here as a student in Tallahassee, was part of the 2000 election process and the marches and the One Florida and Jeb Bush and all that stuff. I completely get when you describe the strength of progressive organizing in the state as being among the strongest it has ever been. Help us, however, then, though, square that with the, again, help me if there are legal lines you got to break here. But help us square that with election results that from 2018, where Democrats, and I would put progressives in that, came within, 0.4%, less than 0.5% of winning the governor's race. I was the nominee at that time, but I'm asking that from a more of a numbers perspective. Presidential races going back 4 cycles, if you will, coming all within about a point or more. All the statewide gubernatorial races over the last 20 years, all being about a point or above. And then this presidential cycle being separated by about 4 points. So tell us how you can be the strongest we've ever been, and not saying progressives are themselves responsible for the outcome, because we know that there are lots of complicators in addition to how you get to 4-point wins. How do you help people understand, okay, strongest here in this segment, and then such a vast difference in outcome on this end?
That's a really great question, and I'm excited to answer it, actually. So it's strongest in terms of resources, able to touch voters, coordination, collaboration, largest election protection program. Then there were also super large C4 independent expenditure programs that happened in Florida that were coordinated very well, exceptionally well. But what we saw in 2020 was a rise in voter turnout on all sides, regardless of party. And that rise in turnout, the numbers didn't necessarily reflect in the favor of the Democratic Party as they did the Republican Party. I think also, and this is just my Corinne Freeman hat.
Put another way, that their voters may have been more motivated, activated, and they're also more of their voters in Florida than there were ours. Well, not ours, but then Democrats.
So I don't know that we can actually factually say that. In terms of activation, the numbers in terms of activation, yes, that is true.
Okay.
Because there were about 300,000 more Republican votes than there were votes for Trump than there were for Joe Biden. But I think we just saw a factor of it was about the heightened voter turnout and who Trump's voters are. And this is from the Corinne Freeman independent person hat.
Yes. Okay, good. Okay.
Who Trump's voters are versus what we would see in 18 or what we would see in 16. It just had a completely different effect. And Donald Trump really did put in work in South Florida. He was on Black radio. He was on Latinx radio in a way that we don't normally hear Republican candidates. He was really reaching out in a way that, at least from the Black perspective, that I have not seen a Republican candidate reach out to Black voters to really vie and get their vote. So they put in that work and they were on the ground canvassing. We believe in the Rona. The coronavirus is real. So we did not have canvassers on the ground. We missed out on a lot of key voter contact that the Trump campaign and his people just went ahead and did. So I think that some of those things also contributed to what it is that we saw. But in terms of what we were able to activate, how money was spent, the amount of people we were able to reroute to their proper polling locations, things of that nature, we've never seen that before.
Got it. Yeah, your capacity just expanded. You had an exploded capacity, especially with the challenge that we have, given the constituencies that we work with, who are oftentimes targeted for the kind of voter disinformation, polling places moving, closing, all that kind of thing, and just the absence of information sharing from the state around just something as simple as portability. If you're in the same county, but you show up at the precinct that isn't the one you're assigned to, you shouldn't have to be the one to know the law and to remind the poll worker that I have portability and I can vote anywhere in this, in this state. So I completely get that. Marcos, I wanted to pick up with you about the same question of one. Tell us target profile, target audience for the work of Alianza for Progress, and then just a little bit about the role your organization played in the 2020 cycle.
Yes, thank you, Andrew, and it's a pleasure to be here on the show today. We targeted and worked as we always do in the I-4 corridor with Puerto Rican constituencies primarily, but also other Latinos that live in those high density Puerto Rican areas. And obviously the Puerto Rican vote is a very highly contested vote. It's a vote that both parties really want to win, or at least win gains in our constituency. And so that's sort of where we operate from, and that's what I'd like to talk about, because obviously a lot of other things happen throughout the state. But before going into that, I wanted to mention that I assume it's general knowledge that Florida really wasn't part of the key strategy for the presidential campaign, right? It wasn't. It was the Rust Belt that was the focus of the presidential campaign. And I want to say that because it's really important for us not to beat ourselves up because of the good work the independent side did to get the vote out, but to understand that Florida was not a top tier battleground state for the presidential race. It wasn't until Bloomberg came in very late with his millions of investment that we were able to really play at a level of a true battleground this cycle. So I want to put that into part of the context of the results that we have here in Florida. Also, like was said already, COVID-19. We were working under a problem with COVID-19, and I'm very proud in my organization that throughout this campaign, which we engaged in for months, there was not a single canvasser, not a single person, and we did some door-to-door at the end, but there was not a single person in our organization that was impacted by COVID-19. And I think that that's a point of pride, something that we set up as a goal when COVID came around. It was to protect the people that worked for us. And I think that was also, had an impact. It clearly created, challenges for us. At the same time, I think it helped develop better strategies in terms of, remote contact that we had with voters. We had much higher contact rates on the phone that we'd had before. Similarly with texting was more effective than in previous cycles. So I think that those things, and it also forced us to engage more in media, right? In social media and also conventional media on the radio. We were more on the radio, we were more on TV than we had been in other cycles. So all of this is interesting about the really new ground that we were in. But I think the newest ground that we're in since 2016 is in the ground that you mentioned, Andrew, which is the ground of disinformation. We, as progressives, most of the leaders in the progressive movement, probably all, a lot of the leaders are very, educated people with a lot of real good theories and a lot of really good background and definitely a lot of experience in what has been the United States of America up until 2016. But I think we're in a different United States of America after 2016. Post-Trump America is a different place. And I think that, in looking at the results in Florida, we need to look at how each of our organizations and each of us as progressive leaders in this space look at organizing and look at messaging and look at what is really at stake and what is being effective and not. And clearly, I think that there's space for us to do some inner analysis and find out how we can do a better job moving forward. It's not that we did a perfect job. I think that there's a lot of things that we need to adjust, and we haven't necessarily adjusted in the last 4 years. It's a new place. It's a new America. And it requires, I think, a new discourse, a new analysis, and I think that's part of what we need to sort of figure out moving forward.
Marcus, you said a lot there. I will tell you, and there are others. Happy to co-sign that far too many conversations at the national level were had in the months leading up to this election and before we had a nominee even, about there being a pathway to the White House that did not include Florida. And I think that there were trickle down impacts, delays that probably, could have been averted. I smiled about that because I was like, it's controversial in some places, but you know what? Hell, if we ain't gonna tell the truth here, where can we tell the truth at? We ought to do that. Marcos, while I have you, I would just like to hear you say a word or two about the Puerto Rican vote, more broadly, the Latino vote in the I-4 corridor, by comparison of how that vote looks in South Florida, because I'm about to go to Andrea to help us dig a little bit into the South Florida picture. But I wanted you to, the geopolitical performance, and I think it's probably less geopolitical performance, but because you're in Central Florida and then we're talking about South Florida, there's a mix of where you are in the state, but also what the Latino population looks like in that part of the state and why it performed the way that it did electorally. I mean, there were seats that were absolutely saved, that were preserved, gains that were made in the I-4 corridor because of the way in which the Latino vote performed there. And there were, without a doubt, some significant losses, and from races local on up in the South Florida area, where Latinos votes were critical to those outcomes. So if you wouldn't mind just spending a moment just defining that for us, because we're talking to, again, an audience that in many ways is more national than specific to Florida.
Mm-hmm. Well, listen, clearly the the idea that Latinos are monolith, I think, has been eradicated, and it's a good thing. It's been a very good conversation in the last 4 years about that. What we saw in the I-4 corridor is very interesting, and I think it responds more to what they did on the other side to appeal to our voters than anything that we did. If we look at the results in every single county in the I-4 corridor, and in the precincts that we looked at, the precincts that have high Puerto Rican and Latino concentrations, in those precincts, in every single one of them, we had more Latinos vote, and in some cases, significantly more Latinos vote.
Over 100% in a couple of them I've seen, yeah.
Where we see a difference is in those urban counties. Obviously, the counties that had the most concentration and where we were obviously concentrated, but they've also invested additional and increasing amounts of resources as well. And in those counties, we see some percentage shifts in favor of Trump that we're looking at very carefully, because it is, in terms of the percentage of our vote, there were some gains for Trump in these Puerto Rican precincts, and we have to state that as a fact,
Yep.
because we're looking at the precinct level data,
Yep.
and we're seeing that. However, in counties like Polk County, Seminole County, well, we don't have the ones from Seminole County. In Polk County, Volusia County, Pasco County, where we have growing populations of Puerto Rican voters, in those counties we saw increases for Biden in the Puerto Rican and Latino vote. So it's very curious. I think that we were also in those counties, and perhaps those counties were not as highly focused on the Latino vote on their side, is a little bit of my theory. And I think, going back to what I think worked effectively for them was the disinformation. We got to understand, when we talk about socialism in the progressive world, we talk about it from ideological, theoretical perspectives, right? Models of arranging the economy. Mm-hmm. The ordinary voter, or the ordinary Latino voter in the I-4 corridor, and I would assume also in South Florida, perhaps to an even larger extent, they don't look at it from ideological or theoretical or political, right to left. They do a little bit, but their question is, what do they think when they see or hear socialism? They think police abuse. They think people protesting in the streets. They think poverty. They think families being torn away, and people having to leave their countries. There's a lot of human pain and emotion associated with how people see socialism, and they might see it as, socialism is a small group of people being favored, and in a racist way, they could say, the Democrats favor blacks over Latinos, and that, I think, is something where they've been effective in splitting people of color up, and even splitting groups of Latinos within our own community, in terms of, these are socialists and these are not, and these are people who like freebies and these are people who don't, and that sort of thing. And I think that they see it in a much more simple, much more experiential, emotional way, not an ideological way. And I think that has had a significant amount of success, not just in South Florida. I think it's having success also across Florida, and I think that we need to find an answer to that, because to this information specifically, because it's based on lies, it's based on manipulations of little pieces of facts, and really creating narratives that are 100% propaganda and false. And I think that we need to figure out how we answer that, because it's a complicated thing. It's been used in other countries. It's being used in other countries today. It's been used by, it was used by Hitler effectively. And I think that we need to sort of really look at and study how we're going to respond to these attacks, because it's not about intelligence. It's not about facts.
Yeah, it's not a head debate. It's not a head debate. This is a heart debate almost.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, you make a great point. And Marcos, one of the points you made, I'm not actually going to circle back to the whole panel to discuss, because I think it's really been under discussed, and Florida's probably the right place to have this discussion. And that is about the kind of racism, anti-blackness, to include what exists as it relates to, the Dominican, Latinos who have very different relationships. And I just would like to hear some real honest conversation about how that showed up. You were the person who made me aware in a post-election conversation that I had with you and a panel of folks in Central Florida about the race for governor, about what was happening in this sort of, I wouldn't say dark circles, but WhatsApp and some of these other technology tools where things were being said and shared that it was all news to me. But I'm going to circle back to that because I want to go to the bigger elephant right now in the room. And that is, even though socialism, it is not a large part of the narrative being told about Florida, the impact of the socialism argument on the Puerto Rican vote and in Central Florida, largely because it tracked with how Puerto Ricans have performed and really overperformed for Democrats these last couple of cycles, although Trump did make, like I said, 4-point gain in that community. Andrea, in your part of the state, it has become much more the predominant narrative that's being talked about, certainly nationally. And I don't want to have people walk away with, if that isn't the singular contributor, I'd like to know your perspective on how it is and why it is that in Miami-Dade, particularly because that is an area in which I know you do a significant amount of work and have done a significant amount of work. This is an area where the Latino vote was won by Hillary Clinton statewide by 30 points. And my race in the race for governor, we underperformed Hillary Clinton's performance amongst Latinos in the state of Florida with 20 point margin in my 2008 race for governor. And then in Miami-Dade County, I said statewide, I'm so sorry. We're talking Miami-Dade County specifically. And then Biden's race, he performed worse than Hillary, who was at 30, me, who was at 20. His advantage in Miami-Dade was 9 points amongst Latinos there. Huge fallout that had 29 electoral vote level consequences, not singularly, but as a contribution to the whole. Can you help us understand from your perspective the communities that you work with? And I've met your organizers. We've tried to pep them up, in very difficult, organizing environments. And again, I know you all work as all groups with a diversity of folks, but help bring us into perspective of what happened here. Were there early signs that you were experiencing on the ground? If there were, from what discrete communities within the Latino population were you hearing them? And then how was that being addressed, not just by you all, but how were you assessing those concerns being addressed by the larger campaign?
Mm-hmm. All right. So a few thoughts here.
Okay.
I think we've been saying, right, that Latino and Black voters are not mobile. They cannot be treated just as a mobilization. Like there has to be persuasion, and it can't start. You can't build this like beautiful political sandcastle 2 months before an election and then have it wash away the week after. I mean, we need long-term infrastructure and organizing. In the state of Florida, we are up against the best funded Republican Party in the nation. We've been leveraging 20 years of a trifecta in Tallahassee to further build out that infrastructure. And Donald Trump and the Republican Party were very clear that there was no path for them to the White House without Florida. Trump moved his official residence to Florida. Brad Parscale moved to Fort Lauderdale years ago. They launched their re-election campaign. Campaign manager. They launched their re-election campaign here, and they invested massively and early. They were all over Spanish language radio. It was surround sound starting in June. And we saw that wasn't just impacting Cuban American voters; it was impacting Colombians and Venezuelans and Peruvians. Like it was all over. It truly was like surround sound, and there was really no response for a long time. And we saw in 2018, they tested so many messages in 2018 during your race when you ran to be the first Black governor of Florida with a unapologetic people's platform. they tested a lot of this messaging. And so there's really no excuse for there not being a more proactive and no answer for it other than the fact that Florida was not prioritized as a tier 1 state by the presidential campaign. There's been a lot of articles writing about this. It was essentially like a feint. They pretended like they were prioritizing Florida to get the Trump campaign to focus here. And that's what made it possible for them to sweep the Rust Belt. So again, I mean, I think that's why I say I'm so proud of like the battle that we fought, because we forced the Republicans to really pour in more here, and for Trump to be focused here, which was what really enabled that win. That, but it came with some bitter, consequences. We lost some congressional champions in Miami-Dade. We lost some state legislative champions. I mean, there are some important bright spots. Danielle Levine Cava.
You got a mayor of the
Right.
largest city.
Danielle
Yes.
was the first woman ever as mayor of Miami-Dade County and the first Democrat in almost 20 years. We won. Right. And we won Amendment 2 minimum wage increase, a raise for 2.5 million Floridians. Now, why more Democrats didn't fully embrace that initiative is beyond me. But, I think organizing and long-term infrastructure is the answer. I mean, I'm an organizer till the day I die. In Jacksonville, where we've been organizing long-term and investing for 8 years, it went blue in your race, and it went blue for the first time in a presidential race since Jimmy Carter. Yes. So, we are making inroads and we are gaining ground, and I couldn't agree more with, Marcos's comments and Corinne's sentiments. We can't, we did not see Florida's 29 electoral votes go to Joe Biden, but it's really the story of where the Republican Party invested massively and early. And, a lot, even for the independent side, we were getting nonpartisan dollars until September. So we weren't really able to wage the battle that was needed. And the presidential campaign didn't really make this a priority. And so, I think there is a lot for us to discuss, what we're going to do in Miami to really counteract the level of organizing and the level of infrastructure that the Republican Party is steadily building. But, I think it has to be an investment in long-term organizing. It can't just be TV ads. It can't just be 2 months before the election or 4 weeks before the election. Or, we're hearing stories of some Spanish language materials like not getting to people until days before the election, which there's really no excuse for. And there's some other structural issues that we need to fix, like the polling and the modeling and leadership. Those are real conversations to be had.
Yeah, I think you're, first of all y'all are right across the board. I'm trying to be a little moderator here and reserve my judgment on some of these things, but I can't help feeling how real this felt in 2018. Immediately after we lost the race for governor, I spoke to the Democratic National Convention's National Finance Committee, and I told them in Washington, D.C. that Florida was tired of being a cheap date. We want to get married. We don't want you parachuting in. We don't want you, talking about us for a presidential race, showing up a few months before trying to buy our television at the end of the process, because everything from, the Koch brothers and their very targeted effort in Central Florida, and especially with evangelical Puerto Ricans, and especially even in South Florida with evangelicals, non-Catholics, but evangelicals that exist in those communities, showing up first, not to say vote Republican, but do you need a housing voucher? How can we facilitate the transportation thing, which is, all of this is such a farce when you consider that they vote against all this stuff in Tallahassee, Florida. They won't do anything from a public policy standpoint in a sustainable way, but for political purposes, they are flogging, to include the deep investments Rick Scott made across all 8 years of his run for governor, using his own personal wealth, funneling that wealth into communities and building greater sympathies there, again, which is why he performed so well in his statewide races. But even he was outperformed by Donald Trump. amongst Hispanics in the state of Florida. And so the alarm bells are like seriously ringing for me because of this idea of demography being destiny. And I think it was something, Andrea, you may have said about we have to go out and compete for every single voter, show up, blah, blah, blah. How in the world? I mean, and how do we begin to turn this tide in a way that doesn't feel transactional, but real and authentic? If you could define what real and authentic looks like for that, because I saw Nancy Pelosi show up and talk in Doral in the Venezuelan community, but it came months after Mike Pence had began his showing up in the Venezuelan community. And Marcos, to your point, this is the disconnect between the intellectual debate around these communities versus the heart, the head versus the heart debate. Because what I saw, we were saying, look, this man denied TPS. Look, deportations are at a record for Venezuelans under this administration. And then on the other end, I would read quotes from Venezuelans that would say, but at least he's talking about us. At least he's putting us. He called the wife of the number one dissident, opposition leader to the president. To me, that seemed like window dressing, but in a lot of ways, it worked for folks to see and hear that they were being prioritized. What does it mean for us, specifically as it relates to the diversity of this demographic, to show up in a way that's more meaningful, less transactional, and thereby have the real ability to turn those voters into true consistent voters, and not ones that every cycle we're having to remake the case that from a public policy standpoint, we're aligned?
Yeah, I think that the Democrats need to have a policy for Latin America that is real and authentic. I don't think that I've seen a real and authentic policy for Latin America on either side since Kennedy and maybe Carter, right? Who really took Latin America serious, and it was a part of the national discourse. Latin America has not been part of the national discourse except for the issue of immigration, in the most part. I would argue, at least on the Democratic side, and when that's a fact, it basically wipes away a lot of the Latin demographic in Florida, in the state of Florida. So it has direct impact on Florida, particularly because Florida has the largest group of new arrivals from Latin America, Puerto Rico, and the Caribbean than any other state in the country, even New York. And so I think that within that context, Latin America is very, very important. And to think about Latin America and to talk about, yes, immigration, yes, Venezuela and Cuba, but also be aggressive about pointing out the fact that there's been more Republican presidents in the years that Cuba has been under the communist regime than there has been Democrats, and they have done absolutely nothing to change the relationship or the situation between Cuba and the United States, and you just call them out on that. They're very, and Marco Rubio and Rick Scott and all of them, they do a fantastic job skimming the surface, right? Talking about it constantly. And that's a smart
thing.
Showing
up seven times to the island.
Look, a lot of it is talking. There's no action behind either party. Let's be real. And in terms of talking, however, there is an unbalance. The Republicans are talking about Latin America. They're talking about Puerto Rico. The Republican Party does not support statehood for Puerto Rico as a party. Mitch McConnell said no to statehood. President Trump said no to statehood, and the Democrats think that statehood is the silver bullet for Puerto Rico. That's completely wrong too, because half of the people are for it and half the people divisive. Are not.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, how the lack of going deep into these analyses. And I'm using the example of Puerto Rico right now, but you could do it about Cuba, you could do it about Venezuela, or any other country. The inability to go deep into the policy and what's really happening underneath is horrible. It's killing the Democrats. And we have to be able to understand that just going to use the example of Puerto Rico. It's the one that's most familiar to me, and the one that I engage in the most with my constituency, and that is, if you're going to be pro statehood, the Republicans are against statehood. There's one thing that doesn't make sense, and secondly, most of the stateholders, or a large number of the stateholders that are Puerto Rican, are Republicans. They're not going to vote for Democrats anyway. Okay, so that 25% that's in the base there for the Republicans is because they're Republicans. It's because they're right-wing people, and that has to be, understood. And so when the Democrats are appealing on this silver bullet issue of statehood, they're appealing to 25% of the people who believe in statehood, basically of Puerto Ricans, and they're also turning away some of the most active Democrats in the party who don't agree with statehood, and they're basically pissing off a lot of the most active Democrats that would be their leaders, would be their fighters, because ideologically, again, on theoretical level, we align on everything else. So just going deeper is essential, on Latin America and the Caribbean is essential in order to win Florida, in my view.
Listen, there's so many angles to hit. What I didn't want this conversation to be was a hot wash. I don't want to hot wash what need to do different. What do we have to do that each organization will get about that work. I know you all as a coalition met yesterday to have, the beginning of some deep dive. And I think all of that is going to be critical. Some of this, however, it needs to be a conversation had inside the House that then produces a plan that flows outside the House and impacts what it is that we do to move forward. But this one piece, and I know that standing up here telling me whatever. So, but I'm going to hit this because I think it's so important. We saw in California when, public policy in that state turned decisively against Latinos in California, specifically Mexicans. The community organizers within the Black community and the Latino community got together and they started building the work of building strong partnership relationship that basically said, we are not going to let these people divide us. We are so much stronger if we combine our collective power. And they have literally flipped that state completely. The political advantage, they can get what they want. They can demand what they want because they have done the difficult work of getting over the divisive, superficial differences to put the interest of their respective communities together and say, y'all, we got more in this thing together than we do divided. I realize that may be easier there because you're not dealing with the same diversity of countries that we may have here in Florida. But in Texas, they are attempting something very, very similar. I talked to Beto about this just last week, the coalition that's trying to be built. So here it is. Race is a real factor between, again, quote, Latino community, Black community. We all know that there are differences underneath. It shows up in a lot of different ways, but particularly in politics, there's been a lot of conversation underneath the surface about how the Black Lives Matter movement, our spring, if you will, that took place this summer, around trying to get some reconciliation, is at least the beginning of a conversation of reconciliation in this country around, race relations. There is polling that suggests that was a major turnoff for major portions of the Latino community here in the state of Florida, the Defund the Police movement, so on and so forth. And there are probably an innumerable amount of examples underneath just those. Can I just hear some reflections from each of you all about, one, whether or not you think this issue of race, and I mean very specifically between these constituencies that I'm talking about, is it real? Is it perceived? Whatever your assessment is of it, then what recommendations do you have? Because this is our work to do. California can't do this for us. Texas can't do this for us. Atlanta, Georgia, and what they've been doing amongst their Black and Latino, they can't do this for us. This is Florida's issue, and if it is an issue to be addressed. So Corinne, I'll start with you because you're on my screen first. And then Andrea, I'll go across to you, and Marcos, I'll end with you on that.
I'm really glad that we got here, because I'm gonna just say it. White supremacy is so deep.
Yeah.
And when you say something like white supremacy, it's immediately a trigger for people. And some people, their ears turn off. Some people, their ears turn on. But understanding white supremacy as an ideology that actually guides the things you do and the way you think and the way you approach things is super important. And I think that we have a problem in our ability in the movement infrastructure, where white supremacy this, anti-blackness that. People don't understand them conceptually.
Yeah.
They don't understand
Yeah.
how they play out, but they are definitely at the root and the heart of what we saw here in Florida, the battle for the nation, the battle for the soul of Florida. And very definitely there are true racial issues. And what I say about white supremacy is it is a mindset that can infect Black people, Latinx people, white people, men, women. Anyone can hold a white supremacist point of view or a mindset. And I think that what we're seeing is a shift toward in Florida, white supremacy, and thinking that if I pull myself up by my own bootstraps, if I disassociate myself from what I'm told Blackness is or the other is, then I am acceptable and I will be able to achieve the things that I want for myself in life. And I really think that that is the battle that we're actually in Florida, and figuring out how are we able to break that mentality, to disassociate the idea of whiteness as supreme and Blackness as the worst. But these are the things that benefit all Floridians, is definitely what we need to do. So I think it's continued ideological values training. We have past power within Florida for All's infrastructure. And then also showing the implications of those ideologies in real time through like our elected officials and our legislators, and continuing to advocate for those things that say, this is what this actually looks like in play when we break this mentality that has a hold on Floridians.
I appreciate that.
Yes, everything that you said, Corinne, there is work to be done. We need to build and continue to build and to cultivate a new majority coalition that doesn't flatten our differences, right? That doesn't flatten our experiences, our differences, but allows us to build those bridges and to show up for each other, and to understand one another's, and a lot of that gets done through and in the work. And the story of California that you share, which I got to experience during my time working there, but then also it's the story of Arizona, right? The fight against SB 1070 as well. And I think that is possible, for Florida. We can see, the transformation of the state, and we need to invest in that visioning and that dreaming, that it's not all about a fight back. It's actually what do we want for our communities and for our children and their children? And then how do we communicate that? And how do we articulate that? And I think, but we also can't forget that the majority of Latinos in the state of Florida and the vast majority of Black voters in the state of Florida voted for Kamala Harris. And we need, and my hope is that they'll invest in engaging in Florida and use the power of that office to have, to spark some conversations, to show up and build some relationships that can help us counteract the massive organizing of the right-wing apparatus. But do we have work to do amongst ourselves? Absolutely, 100%. And I think that if anything, I think some of the hard lessons that we are learning this cycle show us the scale of work that is to be done to build a coalition that's not just going to build bridges between Black and Latino communities, but also build out a progressive white base. Because even if Biden had won Miami-Dade at the levels that Clinton did, we still would have lost the state.
Yeah, the white vote, absolutely.
So there has to be a way that we're talking about, building out, a white progressive voting bloc to vote with Black and Latino voters and people of color. And a way to convince the Democratic Party to invest in persuasion of Latino voters the way that they do of suburban white women.
Which bought them a point nationally, 1 point more than last cycle. But yes, well done, Marcos.
So definitely race is an issue, and it's something that we need to talk about. And I wanted to simply use two examples real quick. Obviously, Alianza and myself and, all of us support the Black Lives Matter movement. But when we posted and we supported, that movement during the days after, George Floyd's murder, it was amazing the amount of commentary coming from Latino followers that all lives matter. And it's obvious, right? It's obvious. It's an obvious reaction. I understand what Black Lives Matter means. And so, from a sophisticated standpoint and from history of being an organizer and involved in communities and working in coalitions, so forth, obviously we understand what it means. But to the ordinary voter who just arrived here with a different white supremacist structure that they brought from their country here, which is different than the white supremacist structure in the United States. And I want to plug this book right here, Latinx, The New Force in American Culture and Politics. Very, very important book. It really explains how different the racial construct is in Latin America than it is in the United States, and how here, when Latinos come in, they come into a binary framework where you're either Black or you're white, and there's no space in the middle. And in the Latin American construct, historically was built that if you were 25%, you could prove you had 25% white blood, you're white. That was the legal framework under the Spanish.
We were Spanish one drop.
And here, one drop makes you Black, right? So
absolutely.
So when you understand those differences that are historical and they're just generations and generations and generations and generations of being built and instilled in people, then you can understand some of the problems that we're having here. Defund the police, another one. My organizers, all my young organizers, Marcos, Alianza has to support defund the police. We have to do it. But wait a minute, what do you mean defund the police? Because for most people, what that means is take away the money from the police. Are people really going to abolish the police? In our community, that's like sort of nonsense. It's talking nonsense.
Yeah.
I understand what defund the police means, and we are clear about what it means. It means, look, redirecting some of the funds to programs that are going to be to get police more aware of racial differences and cultural differences in people, so that they can be better cops. Doing some investment into mental health for police and victims, that sort of thing, like just doing something different with the funding instead of just buying more guns, right? That's what it means to our side. But to the ordinary folks out there, it means we're going to eliminate the police. And that's a very radical concept. That's that when people say socialism, that's what people see. Something, we're gonna eliminate police, and these people want to eliminate police. And so we have to really be introspective, I believe, in terms of and analyze the real anthropological and sociological frameworks that are coming to clash in a new America that's so much more diverse than it ever was. And we're not even talking about the Asian community here. I mean, that's a whole other world, and it's part of us too. So I think that
they are, and I think there was research for the first time they started to associate themselves as a minority, even though previously more closely associated with white, since Trump started calling it the China virus, and then became the objects of such hateful white aggression toward them. Exactly. Listen, y'all, we could do this all day. I've got a panel of elected officials in the next room, but I just want to say, look, none of our work should ever be measured by the outcome of a single elections cycle. That sits at the heart of the C3, C4 coalition and at the heart of the plan to power that you all, and I didn't use the phrasing right for your document that talks about how we flip the state of Florida over a certain number of years, but it requires the kind of consistent long term, don't date me, but marry me, invest in our house, build it, redecorate it, all that kind of thing. It's no different than how you have treated so many of these other places when you go in and you make year after year investments. Florida is the same kind of state. If we do that, then you come and talk to me about how our elections outcome was or wasn't and what we did or didn't do. But for you all, I just want to say, and this is just a sampling of the greatness that exists in the state of Florida from an organizing standpoint. I can't thank y'all enough for the work that you do. And the truth is, we still have a lot of work to do. We're the third largest state in all of America, rapidly diversifying every single day with a huge challenge of educating that same rapidly changing demographic on who we are, what we are going to do for them, and why it is they ought to align with our worldview and our world vision on how we improve their lives. But I appreciate y'all standing in the gap and in the intersection on this work, and look forward to talking to y'all again soon. Thanks, everybody. This has been yet another episode with Andrea and Corinne and Marcos of Real Talk with Andrew Gillum. And this is a part of our series on a dive deep on what's the matter with Florida. Thank y'all. Check us out.